Before we get into this, hit subscribe and drop a like if you're into these deep dives on how wealthy people actually think about money. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And once you're done watching, leave a comment with your own take because this one tends to split opinions hard. Robert Kiyosaki has never had a regular paycheck in decades, and he says that's exactly why he's rich. While most of the world is taught to study hard, get a stable job, and save a portion of every check, Kiyosaki built his entire life around the opposite idea, that a job is not the path to wealth. It's the thing that keeps most people from ever reaching it. To understand how he thinks about money and whether any of it actually applies to your life, you have to start where he did, as a kid in Hawaii with two very different fathers and two very different ideas about what money actually is. Robert Kiyosaki was born in 1947 in Hilo, Hawaii, to a father who represented everything society tells us to admire. Ralph Kiyosaki held a PhD in education, climbed to the top of Hawaii's public school system, and worked hard his entire life. And yet, despite the degrees and the respectable career, the family struggled financially. Robert watched his own father, a brilliant, educated, hardworking man, worry about bills. That contradiction planted the first seed of doubt. If being smart and working hard were enough, why wasn't it working? At age 9, Robert's world split in two. His best friend's father, a businessman with no formal advanced education, started teaching the boys about money using something as simple as a game of Monopoly. This man, the entrepreneur, the investor, the risk-taker, became known in Kiyosaki's later writing as his rich dad. His own father, the accomplished academic who nonetheless lived paycheck to paycheck, became the poor dad. For years, Robert bounced between the two philosophies, testing them against each other, trying to figure out which one actually led somewhere. His rich dad's lessons were blunt and unconventional. Money itself isn't the goal. Assets are. A job pays you for your time. An asset pays you whether you show up or not. The poor and the middle class, rich dad argued, spend their whole lives working for money. The wealthy spend their lives making money work for them. It's a simple idea on paper, but living it out required Robert to unlearn almost everything his own father and the entire school system had taught him about what a safe path looked like. Rich Dad's teaching sessions with the two boys weren't formal lectures. They happened while sweeping floors and stocking shelves in one of Rich Dad's small stores, where he deliberately paid the boys almost nothing, not out of cruelty, but to make a point. If you're angry about being paid too little, Rich Dad told him, that anger is exactly the emotion that keeps people trapped as employees for their entire lives, always chasing the next raise instead of asking a completely different question. How do I stop needing this paycheck at all? It was an uncomfortable lesson for a 9-year-old, but it planted an idea Kiyosaki would return to again and again as an adult. That fear and desire around money are the two emotions employers, banks, and marketers all know how to exploit, and that financial freedom starts with learning to think past them. Meanwhile, his own father, poor dad, kept doubling down on the conventional playbook. Another degree, a better title, a bigger pension. Robert has said he loved and respected his real father deeply, and that the poor dad label was never meant as an insult, but as a description of a mindset trapped inside an otherwise brilliant man. Poor Dad believed the government and the company would take care of him in the end. When Robert got older, he watched that promise strain under real financial pressure, and it reinforced in his mind the core warning Rich Dad had given him years earlier. Never make your financial security someone else's responsibility, not an employer's, not a pension fund's, not the government's. After high school, Kiyosaki didn't head straight into business. He attended the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, then served as a helicopter pilot in the Vietnam War. When he came home, he didn't slide into the corporate track everyone expected. He took a sales job at Xerox, not because he wanted a stable career, but because he wanted to learn how to sell, a skill his rich dad had convinced him was worth more than almost any degree. He was reportedly one of the top performers there, but the entire time he was treating the job as a classroom, not a destination. During his years at Xerox, Kiyosaki wasn't just closing sales for a paycheck. He treated the job as a paid apprenticeship. He said he specifically chose Xerox because it had one of the best sales training programs in the country, and he wanted the skill more than he wanted the salary. He set an internal goal to become one of the top salespeople at the company, not for the bonus, but because he believed the ability to sell, to communicate value, and close a deal was the single most transferable skill an entrepreneur could have, and one that almost no school ever taught. Once he felt he'd extracted what he came for, he left. His first real leap into entrepreneurship came with a business selling nylon and Velcro wallets, sold under a surfer culture brand. It actually took off at first. The product got picked up internationally, and for a moment it looked like Kiyosaki had found his fortune in his 20s. Then it collapsed badly, buried under manufacturing problems, competitors copying the product cheaper, and cash flow mismanagement. He has talked openly about this failure for decades, using it as proof of one of his core beliefs, that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the tuition you pay to get there. Most people, he argues, quit after their first real financial failure because they were taught in school that mistakes are something to be ashamed of, graded in red ink, rather than something to mine for lessons. He kept going and started other ventures afterward, including one in the emerging personal computer education space in the 1980s. Another business that also eventually failed, teaching him more hard lessons about cash flow, partnerships, and scaling too fast. The real turning point wasn't a business. It was real estate. Kiyosaki has told the story of buying his first small investment property in Hawaii, a modest little house near a beach, using very little of his own money down. What made it significant wasn't the size of the deal. It was tiny by later standards. It was the mechanism. He used other people's money, a bank's money essentially, to acquire something that generated income every single month, income that was bigger than the payment on the loan. That gap, what an asset brings in, minus what it costs to hold, is, in Kiyosaki's world, the entire secret of getting rich, and he calls it cash flow. He didn't grow wealthy by earning a bigger salary. He grew wealthy by acquiring things that paid him, one property at a time, using the income from each deal to qualify for and fund the next one. He's described this process as building a snowball. The first deal is the hardest, because you're using savings, sacrifice, and often uncomfortable amounts of debt to get it. But once that first property is cash flowing, its income becomes ammunition for the second deal, and the second for the third. Within a matter of years, he and his wife Kim, who became both his business partner and his co-author, had assembled a real estate portfolio large enough that neither of them technically needed a job anymore. Kim has often told her side of this story separately, describing the fear of walking away from steady income to depend entirely on properties that could, in theory, all sit vacant at once. That fear, both of them have said, never fully disappears. It's simply outweighed by what they see as the much larger risk of depending on a single employer for life. By 1997, Kiyosaki had distilled all of this. His childhood, his two fathers, his failures, his real estate deals, into a book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He initially self-published it because traditional publishers turned it down. It went on to become one of the best-selling personal finance books in history, translated into dozens of languages and sold in the tens of millions of copies worldwide. The book's power wasn't really about spreadsheets or stock tips. It was about reframing how an ordinary person looks at their own financial life. The single idea most people remember from the book is Kiyosaki's definition of assets and liabilities. And it's not the definition you'd find in an accounting textbook. To Kiyosaki, an asset is anything that puts money into your pocket whether you work or not. A rental property, a business you don't have to run day to day, dividend-paying investments, royalties. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket, even if it looks impressive, and this is where his philosophy gets controversial. He classifies the house you live in as a liability, not an asset, because it costs you money every month in the form of a mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, regardless of whether it goes up in value. Most people, he says, spend their entire lives buying liabilities and calling them assets, and wonder why they never get ahead. To explain why people get stuck, Kiyosaki uses a diagram he calls the Cash Flow Quadrant. Picture 4 boxes: E for employee, S for self-employed, B for business owner, and I for investor. Most people spend their whole lives in the E box, trading hours for a paycheck, trading their most limited resource, time, for money, and getting taxed heavily along the way. Some move into the S box, freelancers, consultants, small shop owners, but Kiyosaki argues they've often just built themselves a more demanding job, because if they stop working, the income stops too. The wealth, he insists, is built on the right side of the quadrant, in B and I. Owning systems and businesses that run without your constant presence, and owning investments that generate income passively. His entire philosophy is essentially a roadmap for moving from the left side of that diagram to the right side. Kiyosaki also draws a sharp distinction that trips a lot of readers up. Being self-employed doesn't automatically make you free. A dentist who owns her own practice, a freelance designer, a local shop owner running the register every day. In Kiyosaki's framework, these people often work harder and longer than employees, because if they stop showing up, the revenue stops too. The goal, in his view, isn't just to own something. It's to own something that can run and generate income without your personal labor being the engine behind it. That's the real difference between the S quadrant and the B quadrant. A business owner builds a system. A self-employed person often just built themselves a very demanding job with extra risk attached. He's also been consistently blunt about traditional advice like save money and invest for the long term in a diversified stock portfolio. He doesn't dismiss saving entirely, but he's argued for years that cash sitting in a bank account is quietly losing value to inflation every single year, and that the popular advice to simply max out a retirement account and leave it alone hands control of your financial future to fund managers, fees, and a stock market you don't control and can't predict. He prefers investments where he can see, touch, and directly influence the outcome. A building he can improve and re-rent at a higher price, a business he can restructure, a piece of land he can develop, over a mutual fund whose performance depends entirely on forces far outside his control. This is one of his more contested opinions, since historically, broad low-cost index investing has been one of the most reliable, lower-effort wealth-building tools available to ordinary people. And critics argue Kiyosaki undersells how much risk and effort his own approach actually demands, compared to simply and consistently investing in the market over decades. So how does Kiyosaki actually manage his own money, according to what he's shared publicly over the years? A few threads run through almost everything he says. First, real estate, heavily leveraged, and specifically the kind that produces monthly cash flow rather than the kind he hopes will simply appreciate someday. Kiyosaki has been outspoken about using debt, not to buy things that lose value, like cars or vacations, but to acquire income-producing property. He calls this good debt, debt that someone else effectively pays off for you through rental income, versus bad debt, debt used to buy things that drain your wallet every month with nothing coming back. He's built much of his real-world fortune, by his own account, through apartment complexes, self-storage facilities, and commercial real estate, rather than single-family homes, using bank financing aggressively to control large assets with a relatively small amount of his own cash. A strategy that magnifies gains when property values and rents rise, but just as easily magnifies losses if a market turns, which is exactly the kind of risk his critics point to. Second, he treats gold and silver as a hedge against what he calls fake money, his term for currency that isn't backed by anything tangible and can be printed in essentially unlimited amounts by central banks. He's spoken for years about distrust of paper currency, warning that inflation quietly erodes the value of cash sitting idle, and has positioned physical precious metals as a form of insurance against currency devaluation, sitting alongside his real estate holdings rather than replacing them. Third, more recently, he's added Bitcoin to that same hard money category, describing it in interviews as a form of digital gold, a scarce asset outside the control of any government or central bank. This is one of his more volatile bets, since cryptocurrency prices have swung wildly over the years, and he's faced criticism for publicly predicting both huge price surges and looming crashes at different points, not all of which have played out as forecast. Fourth, He structures much of his financial life through businesses and corporate entities rather than as an individual. This ties back to his own tax philosophy. He argues that the tax code in the US and in many countries is written to reward business owners and investors with deductions and advantages that a regular salaried employee simply doesn't have access to. Where an employee's taxes are taken directly out of their paycheck before they ever see the money, a business owner can often spend on legitimate business expenses first and only get taxed on what's left over. Two specific tools show up constantly in how his team explains this strategy. The first is depreciation, a rule that lets real estate investors deduct a portion of a property's value from their taxable income every year, on paper, even while the property itself is often rising in actual market value. Tom Wheelwright, the CPA who serves as Kiyosaki's tax advisor and calls this the magic of depreciation, has explained that no other major asset class works quite this way. A stock or a business doesn't hand you a yearly deduction just for owning it and holding it. The second tool is the 1031 exchange, a provision that lets an investor sell one property and roll the proceeds directly into another one without paying capital gains tax at the time of the sale, as long as the new property is like-kind. Done repeatedly, this lets an investor trade up from a small rental house to an apartment complex to a large commercial building over the years, deferring taxes at every step, sometimes indefinitely, since under U.S. estate rules, that deferred tax liability can effectively disappear when the property passes to heirs after the owner's death, rather than being sold during their lifetime. Fifth, and maybe most repeated of all across every book, interview, and seminar, financial education. Kiyosaki has said, over and over across decades of public appearances, that the school system teaches people to be good employees, not good investors, how to read, write, and follow instructions, but almost nothing about money itself. How debt actually works, how taxes are calculated, how to read a basic financial statement, how markets move over time. He built an entire company, the Rich Dad Company, and a board game called Cash Flow, specifically designed to simulate escaping the rat race, his term for the cycle of earning, spending, and debt that keeps people stuck in the E quadrant, to teach these concepts outside the traditional classroom, because he believes the gap holding most people back isn't intelligence, it's information they were simply never given. Rich Dad, Poor Dad wasn't a one-off. Kiyosaki turned it into an entire library, more than 24 books, including Cash Flow Quadrant, which expands on the 4-box diagram, Rich Dad's Guide to Investing, aimed at people ready to move past the basics, and later titles like Fake, Fake Money, Fake Teachers, Fake Assets, which lay out his warnings about currency, debt, and what he sees as a broken education system in more detail. He didn't stop at books either. The Rich Dad Company grew into a full education business. Seminars, online courses, licensed coaches around the world, and the Cash Flow board game translated into multiple languages, all built around the same core mission of teaching financial concepts through simulation and story rather than lecture. That education business has itself become part of his income model. And it's worth understanding because it shows how Kiyosaki practices what he preaches. Rather than relying on book royalties alone, which function almost like a paycheck tied directly to sales, he built a company, a brand, and licensing deals around his ideas, turning Rich Dad into an asset in its own right, something that generates income independent of whether he personally writes another word. He's talked in interviews about tracking his net worth not in a single number he broadcasts constantly, but in the monthly cash flow his assets generate versus his expenses, a very literal application of his own definition of being rich. Not how much you have sitting in accounts, but whether the income coming in from things you own is enough to cover your life without you personally trading more hours for it. There's one more framework worth knowing because it shows Kiyosaki thinks about businesses the same way he thinks about real estate, as a system, not a single asset to admire. He calls it the BI triangle, and it maps out 8 things he says every successful business needs, stacked like the layers of a pyramid: mission, leadership, and team at the foundation, followed by cash flow, communications, systems, legal structure, and finally, at the very top, the product or service itself. That order is deliberate and, to a lot of new entrepreneurs, counterintuitive. Most people obsess over the product first, convinced that a great idea is what makes a business succeed. Kiyosaki argues the opposite. A mediocre product wrapped in strong systems, a clear mission, and solid leadership will usually outperform a brilliant product built on a shaky foundation. Because it's the systems and the team that let a business run and scale without the owner personally holding it together every single day. It's the same underlying idea as his real estate strategy, just applied to companies instead of buildings. Build something that works without you, not something that depends entirely on you showing up. Now, it's worth being honest about the other side of this story, because Kiyosaki is not without serious critics, and a full picture of his approach means looking at both. His philosophy leans heavily on the use of debt and leverage, strategies that can build wealth quickly when they work, and destroy it just as quickly when they don't, particularly during downturns in the real estate or credit markets. He's been open about this trade-off himself, describing leverage as a tool that amplifies both success and failure, and admitting that his own path involved real financial risk, not a guaranteed formula. One of his companies, Rich Global LLC, filed for bankruptcy in 2012 following a legal judgment against it, which critics have pointed to as evidence that even Kiyosaki's own ventures aren't immune to the risks his books can make sound manageable. Real estate investor and author John T. Reed has been one of his most vocal critics for years, publicly challenging the accuracy and practicality of specific advice in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, arguing at points that some of it is oversimplified, factually questionable, or potentially reckless for readers who don't share Kiyosaki's resources, risk tolerance, or timing in the market. Other financial commentators have raised similar concerns about some of his more dramatic public predictions, calling market crashes, currency collapses, or specific price targets for gold, silver, or Bitcoin that haven't always played out on the timeline or in the way he forecasted. Because Kiyosaki is also undeniably in the business of selling books, seminars, and coaching, some critics argue his predictions can serve a dual purpose, educating his audience, but also generating urgency that drives people toward his paid products. None of this erases the very real impact his core book has had on how tens of millions of people think about money for the first time. But it's a good reason to treat his specific investment calls as one perspective to weigh carefully alongside other sources, rather than a guaranteed formula to copy exactly. So what can an ordinary person actually take from all of this, without needing millions of dollars, a real estate empire, or an appetite for the kind of leverage that can just as easily wipe someone out? The first lesson is the mental shift, and it costs nothing. Start asking of every purchase, whether it's putting money in your pocket or taking money out. This alone reframes decisions most people make on autopilot. The car payment, the subscription services, the treat-yourself purchases that quietly stack up every month. It doesn't mean never spending on things you enjoy. It means being honest about which column of the ledger they belong in, instead of mentally filing a depreciating car or a bigger house as a smart financial move just because it feels like progress. The second lesson is to stop treating your job as the finish line and start treating it as a funding source. Kiyosaki's own path wasn't to quit his job on day one, it was to use income from work to acquire small income-producing assets on the side, then reinvest what those assets earned into acquiring more. Wealth, in this model, isn't built by a single dramatic leap, a lottery win, or one perfect stock pick. It's built by small, repeated acquisitions of things that pay you, compounding quietly over years, long after the initial excitement of the first deal has worn off. For most people, this looks less like buying an apartment building and more like starting small, a side business that doesn't need your constant presence, a single rental property, dividend-paying shares bought consistently over time, anything that, once acquired, keeps generating income without a new hour of your labor attached to it. The third lesson is to invest in financial literacy before investing in almost anything else. Understanding how interest actually compounds, how mortgages are structured, how the tax code treats different kinds of income, and how to read a basic balance sheet is, in Kiyosaki's view, more valuable than any single stock tip or hot real estate lead. Because that knowledge is what lets you evaluate every future opportunity that comes your way for the rest of your life, instead of depending on someone else to tell you whether a deal is good. He's pointed out, somewhat bluntly, that most people spend more hours researching a vacation or a new phone than they ever spend learning how their own money actually works, and then wonder why their finances feel confusing and out of their control. The fourth lesson is understanding the real difference between good debt and bad debt, and applying it at whatever scale fits your life. Bad debt is anything borrowed to buy something that loses value the moment you drive it off the lot or swipe the card. Vacations financed on credit, cars bought beyond your means, revolving balances on things that are long gone by the time they're paid off. Good debt, in Kiyosaki's framework, is borrowed money used to acquire something that pays for itself and then some. A rental unit whose tenant covers the mortgage. A piece of equipment that lets a small business take on more paying work. The distinction isn't about the size of the loan. It's about whether the debt is working for you or simply funding a lifestyle you can't actually afford yet. The fifth lesson, and probably the hardest one to actually practice, is a different relationship with failure and risk. Kiyosaki's wallet business collapsed. His education software company failed. One of his corporate entities went bankrupt. He's been publicly wrong about market predictions more than once, and his critics have been quick to point it out. What separates his story from someone who simply failed and stopped is that he kept treating every loss as information, rather than as a verdict on his worth or his intelligence. That's a mindset, not a financial strategy on its own, but it may be the one lesson underneath all the others, because none of the other four work if a single setback is enough to make you quit trying. Robert Kiyosaki didn't get rich by being the smartest person in the room, and he'd probably be the first to tell you that. He got where he is by rejecting the idea that a diploma and a steady paycheck were the safest route through life, and betting instead, sometimes recklessly by his critics' account, on assets, ownership, and financial education. He failed publicly more than once and kept building anyway. He picked a side in a debate that's still going on today between the safety of a paycheck and the uncertainty of ownership, and he spent almost 30 years trying to convince people that the safe choice is often the riskier one in disguise, because it hands control of your future to an employer, a market, or a government you don't control. None of that means his exact playbook is the right one for every person watching this. And it's not financial advice. Leverage that works brilliantly in a rising real estate market can wipe someone out in a falling one. And not everyone has the stomach, the timing, or the starting capital. His story sometimes glosses over. But underneath the specific bets on property, gold or Bitcoin, the underlying question he spent decades asking is one worth sitting with, regardless of which investments you eventually choose. Is the money you make working for you while you sleep, or are you the only thing keeping it moving at all? For Kiyosaki, everything else, the two dads, the failed businesses, the real estate deals, the books, the seminars, was just the long answer to that one short question. If this gave you a new way to think about money, tap that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments. Do you agree with Kiyosaki's approach? Or do you think a steady paycheck and a diversified portfolio is still the smarter path? Drop your honest opinion below. I read every one.